$150,000, representing 10 years of my grueling career in financial consulting, evaporated from my savings account in a single night, while my own flesh and blood watched me struggle. I am Mina Vance, a 32-year-old woman who built everything from the ground up. Yet I stood in that lakeside living room watching my older sister smirk as if she had not just committed a federal crime. Myra did not even try to hide her theft. Instead, she snorted across the room while leaning against the mahogany table and claimed, "They needed that money more than I ever would." I looked at my parents expecting a shred of justice, but Arthur and Martha simply nodded in satisfaction, reinforcing the lifelong bitter reality that my hard work was merely a resource for them to exploit. I did not scream or beg for the funds to be returned. I simply picked up my phone and told them they would not mind what was coming next. My family burst out laughing because they thought I was bluffing, but their smiles died instantly when a loud bang shook the entire house and the local authorities began to swarm the entrance. Before I reveal the cold details of how I dismantled their entitlement, please tell me what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that blood does not give anyone the right to steal your future, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where karma finally catches up with the people who deserve it most. My family ignored the fact that every cent in that account was a piece of my life, a fragment of my health and sanity that I had sacrificed, while they were busy spending money they never earned, and their betrayal was the final spark that ignited a fire they would never be able to put out, even with a lifetime of apologies. The complex and painful hierarchy within the Vance household was firmly established long before I was old enough to understand the concept of a bank account or the value of a dollar. It was a structure where my needs, my dreams, and my very presence were always secondary to the whims and demands of my older sister Myra. Growing up in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Chicago, Mom and Dad treated Myra like a delicate porcelain doll that needed constant protection and adoration, while I was viewed as the sturdy, invisible workhorse whose only job was to stay quiet and facilitate her comfort at all costs. I remember clearly how Martha would look through me during dinner, as if I were a piece of furniture, handing me Myra's stained and tattered hand-me-downs, while telling me that I should be profoundly grateful to have clothes at all because the family budget was extremely tight. That budget was only tight because they were funneling every spare cent into Myra's failed hobbies and expensive whims, from professional violin lessons she quit after a single month to designer outfits she outgrew before the price tags were even removed from the fabric. When I brought home a straight-A report card from school, Arthur would barely grunt an acknowledgement without looking away from the television screen. Yet when Myra barely scraped a passing grade in a basic subject, they would celebrate as if she had won a prestigious Nobel Prize. This systemic and calculated favoritism was not just about material things. It was a constant grinding psychological pressure that taught me my only value lay in my utility to the family unit. I was expected to clean the entire kitchen while Myra napped in her air-conditioned room, to run complicated errands while she hung out with her popular friends, and to never ever complain about the blatant imbalance of affection in our home. As we grew older and entered the real world, the demands only intensified, and the unspoken expectation that I would eventually become the family's financial savior was whispered by Mom during every holiday meal we shared. Myra drifted from one half-baked and expensive career idea to another, always supported by my parents' dwindling retirement savings, while I worked 3 different part-time jobs simultaneously just to pay for my university textbooks and tuition. They never once asked if I was tired. They never asked if I was stressed or overwhelmed. They only asked when my next paycheck was coming, and how much of it I could contribute to Myra's latest self-inflicted emergency. My sister had a peculiar and dangerous talent for creating crises that required exactly the amount of money I had managed to painstakingly save through my own sweat and tears. Dad would use a toxic and manipulative mixture of guilt and paternal authority to ensure I handed it over without a single question or complaint. Family is a circle, Mina, he would say, in that booming, authoritative voice that used to terrify me as a child. And right now, your sister is the weak link that we all have an obligation to strengthen for the sake of our collective survival. He never realized that by constantly reinforcing the weak link, they were actually creating a greedy predator who viewed my hard work as her personal inheritance and my boundaries as an unforgivable insult to her very existence. By the time I graduated and moved into the city to start my grueling career in financial consulting, I was already completely burnt out from a lifetime of being a human backup generator for people who refused to fuel themselves. I watched with a mixture of dread and pity as Myra married Silas, a man whose overwhelming arrogance was only matched by his profound and deep-seated laziness, and I saw how my parents embraced him as a new mouth for me to feed. Silas would sit at our family dinners and talk loudly about his grand visions for real estate developments and luxury empires, while Arthur and Martha would look at him with a pride they never once showed for my actual tangible professional achievements in the real world. They saw my success not as a result of my merit or my intelligence, but as a communal pool of wealth that I was being miserly and cruel for trying to keep for my own future. Mom would call my office at the most inconvenient times, interrupting high-stakes meetings with international clients, to cry about Myra's car being towed or Silas's credit card being declined at a high-end restaurant. She would always end the conversation with a demand for a small loan that she and I both knew would never be repaid or even acknowledged again. I started to build high walls, both financial and emotional, but the deep-seated guilt they had installed in me since my earliest childhood was a powerful and effective tool that they knew how to wield with surgical precision whenever they needed something. My parents didn't see a daughter who was working 80 exhausting hours a week until her eyes bled from the screen glare. They saw a high-limit credit card with a pulse and a sense of obligation. Myra's resentment of my success grew in tandem with her absolute reliance on it, a poisonous and volatile combination that made her feel entitled to everything I owned, simply because we shared a surname and a history of shared meals. Every time I tried to set a firm boundary, Mom would accuse me of forgetting where I came from and who had raised me, and Dad would remind me that one day I would surely need them, though we all knew that day would never actually come. I was the one who paid for their lavish 40-year anniversary dinners, the one who bought them a high-end refrigerator when theirs broke in the middle of summer, and the one who stood as the silent, unthanked guardian against their total financial ruin. Yet in their distorted eyes, I was still just the difficult and cold child who was too focused on money and numbers, while Myra was the warm soul of the family who just needed a little more help to finally find her way in life. This dynamic created a dangerous vacuum of accountability that Myra and Silas were more than happy to fill, with their escalating greed and their total lack of remorse for how their actions affected my life. I didn't realize back then that by being the responsible and reliable one, I was actually training them to be professional victims who saw my life savings as their ultimate prize to be seized. The house at Lake Tahoe was meant to be a joyous celebration of family unity, but for them it was a carefully chosen hunting ground where they could finally corner their favorite prey and take everything I had built in a single coordinated strike. I had spent 32 years of my life trying to earn a love that was never actually for sale, only to find out at the worst possible moment that the price of admission to this family was my total financial and emotional destruction. 5 years ago, I stood in the magnificent glass-walled lobby of a top-tier financial firm in the heart of downtown Chicago, clutching my leather briefcase so hard that my knuckles turned bone white while I swore a silent, solemn oath to myself. I promised that I would never again let my basic survival or my peace of mind depend on the whims, the moods, or the supposed charity of my family members. That first year in the industry was a brutal and unforgiving initiation into the world of high-stakes consulting where I routinely clocked 80-hour work weeks and survived on nothing but lukewarm office coffee and the sheer raw adrenaline of outperforming every single one of my peers. I lived in a cramped, poorly lit studio apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors' every argument and every television show. But I didn't care about the lack of luxury, because every dollar I saved was a solid brick in the fortress of my future independence. I carefully and methodically mapped out my path to $150,000, a figure that represented far more than just a down payment on a beautiful home. It was the exact price of my total freedom from the Vance family's suffocating and endless expectations. While my colleagues were spending their massive year-end bonuses on luxury watches, designer shoes, and impulsive weekend trips to Las Vegas, I was eating meal-prepped pasta at my desk and pouring every single cent into high-yield investment accounts that they didn't even know existed. I became a true master of numbers and data because numbers were the only things in my life that didn't lie to me, didn't manipulate my emotions, and didn't demand unconditional love in exchange for basic loyalty. Sarah, my only true and loyal friend, would often visit me at my office late at night, just to make sure I was still eating and breathing, and she was the only person in the world who knew the true burning extent of my ambition. She watched me turn down a major promotion that required even more international travel because I knew I needed to stay close to my investments and maintain my focus on the finish line. Sarah was the one who listened without judgment when I broke down in tears after a particularly vicious and guilt-tripping phone call from Mom during the holidays. Martha would call me just to complain that Myra's latest business venture, which was a boutique candle line that never actually produced a single scented candle, had failed miserably, and she expected me to cover the back rent for Myra's expensive art studio. I told her no for the first time in my entire life, and the long, icy silence on the other end of the line was followed by a 20-minute lecture on how my financial success was making me cold, arrogant, and unrecognizable to my own kin. Despite their constant and creative attempts to guilt me into submission, I hit my first $50,000 milestone, and the feeling of absolute security it provided was more intoxicating than any drug or any praise I had ever received. I learned the hard way to hide my true income and my bank statements from my parents, creating a separate public account that showed a modest and unremarkable balance, while my real wealth grew in a hidden fund designed for maximum protection and privacy. I watched from a safe distance as Myra and Silas lived a life of pure, unadulterated fiction, posting high-quality photos of fancy dinners and rented luxury cars on social media, while I knew for a cold fact that Dad was dipping into his 401k just to pay their monthly electricity bills. Every time I visited the family home, Arthur would interrogate me about my little savings, his eyes flickering with a disturbing mixture of suspicion and greed that made my skin crawl with an instinctive discomfort. He would suggest with a forced and paternal smile that I should invest my hard-earned money into one of Silas's guaranteed real estate flips in the West Side, but I always declined with a practiced professional smile and a vague rehearsed excuse about my company's strict and non-negotiable conflict of interest policies. I spent my 30th birthday entirely alone in a cold hotel room in New York City, working on a complex merger deal, and when the clock finally struck midnight, I didn't celebrate with expensive champagne or a party. I simply checked my bank balance on my phone and saw that I was only $20,000 away from my ultimate goal of $150,000. The isolation and the social sacrifices were a small and necessary price to pay for the knowledge that I was finally becoming financially untouchable, a woman who didn't need a single person from her past to survive or thrive in the present. However, the more I succeeded in my career, the more Myra's deep-seated resentment simmered just beneath the surface, a quiet and deadly envy that she masked with fake smiles and sudden uncharacteristic questions about my bank's advanced security protocols. She started dropping by my apartment unannounced and uninvited, claiming she was just in the neighborhood for a coffee, but I caught her more than once, eyeing the private mail on my kitchen counter or trying to peek at my laptop screen while I was in the bathroom. My parents encouraged this newfound and suspicious sisterly bond, telling me how wonderful and heartwarming it was that Myra was finally trying to be close to me again after years of distance. I knew deep down that she was just a hungry shark circling a scent of blood in the water, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when my guard was down. A small, wounded, and naive part of me still desperately wanted to believe that she had finally changed for the better, because I still craved a sister who would just be a friend rather than a constant and bitter competitor. That tiny, lingering sliver of hope was my greatest and most dangerous weakness, the one crack in my carefully built armor that Myra and Silas were preparing to exploit with the cold patience of professional con artists. I finally reached the $150,000 mark on a rainy Tuesday in October, and I remember sitting in my car in the office parking lot and crying tears of pure, overwhelming relief because I honestly thought I was finally safe from them. I started looking at high-end listings for a penthouse with a breathtaking view of the lake, a place with a state-of-the-art security system, and a heavy steel door that would keep the entire world, and especially my family, at a very comfortable and permanent distance. I was so blinded by my own hard-won success and the looming prospect of a brand new life that I didn't see the massive trap being laid right at my feet by the very people I called Mom and Dad. I began to spend more of my free time imagining the modern furniture and the decor for my new home than I did monitoring the subtle and dangerous shifts in Myra's manipulative behavior, a mistake that would soon cost me every single thing I had worked so hard for. Sarah warned me repeatedly that Myra's sudden and excessive kindness felt like the eerie calm before a devastating storm, but I dismissed her concerns with a wave of my hand, wanting to believe for once that my family was actually capable of genuine affection without a hidden price tag. I didn't realize that my success had made me a target of a completely different and more malicious kind, one that didn't just want my money but wanted to humiliate and destroy me for ever thinking I could be better or more independent than the rest of them. Approximately 1 year ago, the carefully constructed and reinforced walls I had built around my heart and my finances suffered a catastrophic, life-altering breach during a weekend visit to my parents' home that I now realize was a calculated ambush disguised as a family reunion. Myra and Silas arrived looking uncharacteristically haggard, their faces pale and eyes sunken, a stark and deliberate contrast to their usual arrogant facade of unearned wealth and luxury. Before the first course of Martha's home-cooked dinner was even served, the weeping began in earnest, orchestrated with the precision of a Broadway performance designed to tug at every lingering thread of my guilt. Myra lured me into the quiet of the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen from what I now know were manufactured crocodile tears, and she began to spin a harrowing story about a massive business deal gone wrong that had supposedly left them on the verge of losing their home and their only vehicle. She looked me directly in the eyes, her voice trembling with a fake desperation, and swore on the sacred memory of our late grandmother that she only needed a co-signer for a short-term bridge loan and a new car lease to keep their lives from falling into total ruin. Silas stood in the shadowy doorway, with a look of practiced, nauseating humility, apologizing for his failures, and promising me with a straight face that he would work day and night to ensure I never regretted this one-time act of sisterly generosity. My parents appeared behind him like a silent, judgmental jury, their presence adding an unbearable weight to the atmosphere of the room. Dad placed a heavy, demanding hand on my shoulder, his grip firm as he told me in that low, authoritative rumble that family meant protecting one another when the world got too cold to handle his words, carrying a sharp edge of disappointment that I knew all too well. I felt the old familiar and suffocating pressure tightening in my chest, that deep-seated sense of filial duty that they had spent my entire upbringing installing in my psyche, like a malicious software virus designed to override my logic and self-preservation. I argued with every ounce of strength I had, stating that my credit score and my financial standing were the only things I truly had to my name after a decade of sacrifice, but Martha began to sob hysterically into her apron. She accused me of being a heartless, cold-blooded robot who valued digital numbers in a bank account more than the physical survival and happiness of her own flesh and blood. They didn't just want a signature on a piece of paper, they wanted to bind me to their inevitable failures, to ensure that if they went down, I would be dragged into the abyss, right along with them as their unwilling sacrificial lamb. Against every professional instinct, every piece of financial training, and every alarm bell screaming in my head, I finally picked up the pen and signed those documents, a decision that felt like swallowing cold, heavy lead the moment the ink touched the page. I watched as Myra's tears vanished almost instantly, replaced by a quick, triumphant glint in her eyes that should have been the final warning I needed to walk away and never look back. For the next several months, I lived in a state of constant high-alert anxiety, watching my credit monitoring apps like a hungry hawk as the predictable reality began to unfold. Silas was barely making the minimum payments on the car, and the interest on the bridge loan was ballooning at an alarming rate due to their continued and intentional negligence of their responsibilities. Every time I confronted Myra about the late notices piling up in my mailbox, she would dismiss my concerns with a sharp wave of her hand and a roll of her eyes, telling me that I was being a typical paranoid bean counter and that everything was under control. Meanwhile, Silas simply stopped answering my phone calls altogether, leaving me to deal with the mounting pressure of the lenders who now saw me as the primary source of recovery. I realized too late that I had not actually helped them find stability. I had merely enabled their parasitic lifestyle and given them a direct legal tether to my own hard-earned financial identity and future. They began to use my name and my stellar credit history as a bulletproof shield, knowing with absolute certainty that I would do anything, pay anything, to protect my hard-won professional reputation in the consulting world. My parents actively encouraged this predatory behavior, telling me at every opportunity that I should be profoundly grateful to be in a position to help my sister, even as I watched my peace of mind disintegrate under the weight of their combined suffocating entitlement. Sarah warned me repeatedly that I was being hunted by my own kin, that they saw me as a bottomless well. They could drain until I was as dry and hollow as a desert bone, but a stubborn part of me still hoped I could manage the situation without a total family explosion. I spent my nights poring over the complex legal language of the documents I had signed, desperately looking for an exit strategy that wouldn't ruin my career or my credit score. But the trap was deeper and more intricate than I had ever imagined when I stood in that kitchen. Myra began to ask more probing, invasive, and suspicious questions about my primary savings account, pretending to be interested in my investment strategies, while she was actually searching for the digital keys to my kingdom. I foolishly left my laptop open and logged in during a family dinner while I went outside to help Mom in the garden, a small but fatal mistake that would eventually cost me my entire $150,000 house fund and any remaining shred of love or loyalty I had left for my siblings. They didn't just want a helping hand or a temporary loan. They wanted to steal the very ground I stood on, because they believed in their hearts that my success was a communal property. They had an absolute divine right to seize whenever they saw fit. The betrayal was not a sudden impulsive act born of a moment's desperation, but a calculated long-term operation designed by Myra and Silas, with the silent nodding and supportive blessing of the two people who were supposed to protect me most from the cruelty of the world. The weekend at the secluded luxury cabin on the pristine edge of Lake Tahoe was meticulously marketed by my parents as a long overdue reconciliation, a chance for the Vance family to finally heal the deep fractures that my supposed financial rigidity had caused over the years. I arrived on a crisp Friday evening, the cool mountain air doing absolutely nothing to soothe the heavy knot of apprehension that had been tightening in my stomach since I crossed the state border into California. Silas had gone out of his way to arrange a lavish multi-course dinner with expensive professional catering and vintage wines acting the part of the perfect, generous, and successful host, while Myra played the role of the doting, supportive sister, constantly refilling my glass with a forced smile. After the meal, we sat by the massive roaring stone fireplace, and Mom began a long scripted and emotional speech about how proud she was that we were all finally together in one place without any talk of debts, business, or the stresses of money. I felt a rare and fleeting moment of peace, a dangerous sense of false security that allowed me to lower my guard just enough to leave my laptop and my phone on the side table when I went upstairs to take a long, hot bath to ease my aching, stressed muscles. I spent nearly an hour in the tub, lost in daydreams of finally buying my penthouse in Chicago and closing the final chapter on my family's exhausting financial dependency, completely unaware that downstairs a digital assassination of my entire future was taking place with clinical precision. When I finally emerged and went to bed, I fell into a deep, heavy, and dreamless sleep, likely aided by the high-alcohol red wine Myra had been so insistent on me finishing to celebrate our renewed sisterhood and family bond. I woke up the next morning to a house that felt unnaturally quiet, a heavy stillness that hummed with a hidden electricity of guilt and betrayal that I could feel in the very marrow of my bones before I even opened my eyes. My phone was not on the nightstand where I was certain I had left it, and when I finally found it tucked deep under a sofa cushion in the living room, the screen was illuminated with a flurry of increasingly urgent and alarming notifications from my banking application. I opened the application with a sense of dread that felt like ice water being injected into my veins, and my heart nearly stopped beating when I saw a balance of exactly $0 where my $150,000 house fund used to be. Every single cent had been moved through a series of complex high-speed and automated wire transfers to a holding company in the Cayman Islands, a company whose name I recognized from one of Silas's failed offshore investment pitch decks he had tried to show me months ago. I walked into the kitchen, my legs feeling like they belonged to a stranger, and found the four of them sitting around the breakfast table eating pancakes and sipping coffee, with a calm that was absolutely terrifying and sociopathic to witness. When I threw my phone onto the table and demanded an immediate explanation for the theft of my life's work, Myra didn't even stop chewing her food. She simply looked up and told me in a flat voice that the money was being reinvested for the collective good and long-term stability of the entire family. Silas had a smirk on his face that made me want to scream with rage, a look of pure predatory triumph as he explained that my savings were now part of a vital capital injection for his new development firm. He actually had the audacity to tell me that I should be thanking him for finally putting my stagnant cash to good use, instead of letting it sit in a low-interest savings account like a coward who was afraid of real growth. I turned to Arthur, begging him with my eyes to tell me he didn't know about this, but my father just looked down at his coffee mug and told me that Myra and Silas had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that required immediate liquidity, and as the successful one, it was my duty to provide it. Martha added with a sickeningly sweet tone that I was being incredibly selfish and dramatic for making a scene over money when my sister's future was finally looking bright and promising. It was as if my 10 years of grueling labor, my missed birthdays, My ruined health and my sleepless nights were nothing more than an optional donation to Myra's insatiable ego and Silas's delusions of grandeur. They had sat there all night long watching my accounts drain to zero, watching my dreams for a home and a stable future evaporate into nothingness, and they had done it with a smile on their faces, while I slept defenseless just 10 feet away from them. I realized in that moment with a clarity that was both cold and liberating that they had never truly loved me as a daughter or a sister. They had only ever tolerated me as long as I was a reliable source of profit and security. Now that they had taken everything I had, they didn't even feel the basic human need to pretend anymore. The masks had fully slipped, revealing the monsters beneath. Myra stood up and walked over to me, her voice dripping with a fake condescending sympathy, as she told me that I was still young enough to earn it all back, and that I shouldn't let my petty materialism ruin what was otherwise a beautiful family weekend at the lake. I looked at the 4 people who shared my DNA, the people who were supposed to be my ultimate safety net in a cruel world, and I saw nothing but strangers, a group of parasites who had successfully harvested their host and were now waiting for me to apologize for being upset about being bled dry. 2 hours after the confrontation that effectively and permanently ended my relationship with my family, I was parked in the back of a dusty, half-empty diner 10 miles down the mountain road, my laptop tethered to my phone's hotspot as I began the digital counter-siege of their lives. My first call was not to the local police, who I knew would likely view this as a civil family dispute, but to my Leo, who was finishing his final year of law school with a prestigious specialization in white-collar crime and digital asset recovery in the city. When I explained the situation, I could hear the cold, sharp fury in his voice, but he immediately shifted into a professional analytical mode, telling me exactly what steps we needed to take to ensure Myra and Silas felt the full, unmitigated weight of their criminal actions. Leo guided me through the complex process of reporting the wire transfers as fraudulent and unauthorized, emphasizing that since they had used my physical device and my stolen password, we needed to provide immediate documented evidence of coercion and prior financial abuse to the bank's fraud department. I then took the most calculated and high-stakes risk of my professional life and initiated a co-signer release trigger through the primary lenders of the car lease and the bridge loan I had been forced to sign a year ago. Because I had been smart enough to insist on a specific obscure clause in the original co-signing documents that allowed me to trigger an immediate default and withdrawal of my guarantee if the other party was involved in documented illegal acts, I was now able to turn their own greed against them like a weapon. I spent the next several grueling hours on the phone with my firm's top legal department and my own private attorney, authorizing them to begin the immediate process of suing Myra and Silas for the full recovery of the funds and for multiple counts of identity theft and wire fraud. I also contacted my primary bank to cancel the supplementary credit cards I had issued to Mom and Dad for their supposed emergencies effectively, and finally cutting off the flow of cash they had been siphoning from me for years, without a single word of gratitude or respect. Every call I made was a surgical precise strike against the very infrastructure of their parasitic existence. A calculated effort to reclaim my power and ensure that they could never hurt me or my credit ever again. Sarah joined me at the diner an hour later, bringing a bag of my essential belongings she had gathered from my apartment, and a stack of folders containing years of financial records I had kept for just such a disaster. Her presence was a stark and beautiful contrast to the betrayal I had just experienced from my own blood, a reminder that loyalty is a choice, not a birthright. We spent the rest of the night in a nearby hotel room, with Leo joining us via an encrypted video call to finalize the legal plan for the following morning, when the authorities would be fully involved in the arrest of my sister and her husband. I realized that the loud bang my family would soon hear wasn't just a literary metaphor, it was the sound of their entire world collapsing under the heavy weight of the debts and crimes they had accumulated in my name, while they thought they were winning. I had spent years being their personal bank and their emotional shield, but as of that afternoon, I had become their greatest and most dangerous adversary, and I felt a cold, sharp, and undeniable satisfaction in that transformation. I knew that by triggering the default on the luxury car and the bridge loan, I was forcing a violent chain reaction that would lead to immediate public repossessions and a total irreversible collapse of their credit scores and reputations. I also discovered through a deep dive into my credit report with Leo that Silas had been using my name to open several smaller lines of credit and store cards that I hadn't even been aware of, which I immediately flagged for a federal investigation, adding more weight to the criminal case building against him. My parents would lose their primary source of income and their comfortable lifestyle now that I had finally cut them off completely, and they would be forced to face the harsh, cold reality of the daughter they had discarded in favor of a common, greedy thief. I was no longer interested in being the good daughter, the reliable sister, or the responsible one who fixed everyone's mistakes. I was now a woman who understood that true justice often required the absolute, uncompromising, and total destruction of the status quo. I didn't sleep at all that night, but for the first time in my 32 years of life, I wasn't awake because of anxiety, guilt, or fear of their disappointment. I was awake because I was finally legally and spiritually free of the burden of carrying people who would rather rob me of my future than love me for who I was. I felt like a soldier preparing for the final battle, and as the sun began to rise over the Tahoe Mountains, I knew that the woman who walked into that cabin was dead, and the woman who replaced her was someone my family should have feared from the very beginning. The aftermath of my counteroffensive was swift and devastating, proving that when you remove the foundation of a structure built on lies, the entire thing comes crashing down with terrifying and irreversible speed. Less than 48 hours after the theft at the lake house, the luxury SUV I had co-signed for was towed from the driveway of Myra and Silas's home, while the neighbors watched in stunned silence. It was a public humiliation that Myra tried to stop by screaming at the repossession agent, waving her hands and threatening legal action until she was nearly hoarse from the effort, but the agent simply pointed to the default notice triggered by my affidavit. When she tried to use her personal credit cards to pay for a rental car to flee the scene, she found every single one of them declined, as I had successfully flagged their entire financial profile for investigation related to the unauthorized transfers from my account. Silas attempted to flee to a neighboring state to avoid the mounting legal pressure, but he was intercepted by local law enforcement at a Greyhound station due to the identity theft and wire fraud charges I had filed with Leo's expert assistance. My parents were not spared from the fallout, as they soon realized that the comfortable, subsidized lifestyle they enjoyed was entirely dependent on the credit and cash I had provided, all of which was now permanently and legally severed. They called me hundreds of times, their messages shifting from angry, incoherent demands for me to fix this situation to pathetic weeping pleas for me to show mercy because they were elderly and had nowhere else to turn for their monthly expenses. I listened to one particular voicemail where Dad accused me of being a monster for letting Myra face a jail cell over a little family squabble. But I felt nothing but a cold, hard indifference, because his definition of family only applied when I was the one being exploited for my labor. The house they lived in, which I had been secretly helping pay the mortgage on for years through a hidden trust, was suddenly at risk of foreclosure, as I stopped the automated payments and informed the bank of the fraudulent activities tied to my family's names. Myra was eventually charged with grand larceny and multiple counts of identity theft, And since Silas had a prior, undisclosed record of financial misconduct in another state, the prosecutor was not interested in offering any form of a lenient plea deal for either of them. I watched through the thick, reinforced glass of a courtroom as my sister was led away in handcuffs, her designer clothes replaced by a standard-issued jumpsuit, and her face pale with a terror she had never known because Mom and Dad had always been there to shield her from the consequences of her own greed. They weren't there to save her this time because they were too busy trying to figure out how to pay for their own basic utilities and groceries without the monthly allowance they had bullied me into providing for decades. The betrayal they had committed at the lake house was so blatant, and the digital evidence I had gathered was so overwhelming that the bank was forced to reimburse the majority of my stolen funds under their strict fraud protection policies. The remaining balance was a small, negligible price to pay for the permanent removal of these toxic predators from my life and the total reclamation of my personal and financial autonomy. Sarah stayed by my side through every grueling deposition and every late-night meeting with the district attorney, reminding me that the guilt I occasionally felt was just a lingering symptom of the years of gaslighting I had endured at the hands of those people. Leo handled all direct communication with our parents, acting as a sturdy buffer that allowed me to focus on rebuilding my mental health and my professional standing without being poisoned by their manipulation once again. 1 year has passed since the night at Lake Tahoe, and the life I have meticulously built in the wake of that total destruction is more beautiful and stable than anything I could have imagined when I was still under their thumb. I moved to a different city where the air feels lighter and bought that penthouse apartment with the floor-to-ceiling windows filling it with things that I love and people who respect my boundaries without ever asking for a cent in return. Myra is currently serving her sentence in a minimum security facility, where she finally has the time to reflect on the cost of her entitlement, while Silas disappeared shortly after his release on bail, leaving my sister to face the wreckage of their joint greed entirely alone. Mom and Dad were forced to sell their large suburban home and move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment, living on their meager Social Security checks, and the bitter realization that the daughter they ignored was the only thing standing between them and poverty. I do not send them money, I do not take their calls, and I do not attend family gatherings, because I finally understand that forgiveness without a fundamental change in behavior is just a formal invitation for further abuse. I spend my weekends with Sarah and Leo building a new kind of chosen family based on mutual respect, shared values, and the simple, quiet joy of being together without an underlying financial agenda. My career has reached unprecedented heights because I am no longer distracted by the constant fabricated emergencies of people who only saw me as a biological ATM with a pulse. I have started a mentorship program for young professionals coming from toxic or high-control families, teaching them that their success is theirs alone to keep, and that no is the most powerful word in the English language. I tell them my story not to garner sympathy or to dwell on the past, but to prove that it is possible to survive the ultimate betrayal and come out on the other side, stronger, wealthier, and completely whole. The $150,000 is back in my account, but it no longer represents a house fund. It represents my absolute freedom and my ability to say no to anyone who tries to diminish my value or steal my peace. Looking back, the theft at the cabin was the most agonizing experience of my life, but it was also the most necessary because it forced me to finally see the truth and act upon it with the same ruthlessness they used against me. I have learned that blood does not entitle anyone to break your spirit, and that the word family is a sacred privilege that must be earned every single day through kindness, integrity, and reciprocal support. I am no longer the responsible daughter or the family scapegoat. I am simply Mina, a woman who knows her worth and is no longer afraid to defend it against the entire world, even if that world includes the people who gave her life. Thank you for listening to my story and for walking this difficult emotional path with me until the very end of this journey. If you have ever felt the sharp sting of betrayal from the people who were supposed to protect you most, please know that you are not alone and that your survival and success are your greatest victories over those who tried to keep you small. Your courage to set boundaries and walk away from toxicity is the highest form of self-love you can practice. And I hope my story gives you the strength to realize that your life belongs to you and no one else. The lesson here is clear because money can be earned back, but your self-respect and your peace of mind are priceless assets that you must protect at all costs, even if it means cutting ties with the only family you have ever known. Drop a comment below and share your own thoughts on the price of family loyalty, or let me know if you have ever had to make the difficult choice to walk away from a toxic situation to save your own future. I want to know where you are watching from and what your city's time is right now, as it helps me understand how many people are seeking the courage to reclaim their lives. I read every single one of your stories, and your shared experiences and resilience inspire me to keep speaking my truth. So do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about justice, boundaries, and rebuilding a life worth living. We all deserve to be safe and respected, especially within the walls of our own homes, and sometimes the only way to find that safety is to be the one brave enough to say enough is enough. Your future is far more valuable than any legacy of pain or any obligation to people who do not truly value your heart, so keep building your fortress and never look back. Thank you for being part of my recovery and my new life, and remember that you hold the power to change your narrative at any moment.